When I was about 11 or 12 years old, I discovered Monty Python. Maybe you did around that age as well. I had to do this in an age when you still had rabbit ears on TV, and you could only watch this British comedy show on PBS after your parents went to bed. It was only on late at night, and you had to futz with the antenna on the TV. And I saw something there in the comedy and the sketches that they did that just grabbed me. I couldn't get away from it. The comedy and the humor was surreal. It was unpredictable. I had no idea how an individual skit would end and what the next one would bring. It was original. I'd never seen anything like it in American TV programming. And it was, of course, as most people think of the kind of humor that was in Monty Python, and the word that they use, it was subversive. It was a place where, as an 11 or 12-year-old growing up in Texas, you could see the world of adults and grown-ups satirized and made fun of, where businessmen who acted very pompously were put in their place, where you could satirize political leaders, we could look at the military in a new way, and even the clergy, and satirize religion. And when I would watch this over and over, I would get together with my friends who were also watching it, and of course you get into the quotables, and we would try to reproduce the scenes and make new jokes that might fit into that, and we'd try to do that, and it's hard. You can't reproduce what they did, and I don't think anybody ever has been really able to succeed that work. And in there, I started to try to figure out what made that comedy troupe so creative and original. Because I think it's the way that they were creative and original that shows us, first of all, what was subversive about what they were doing, and what it is that's in there that I think actually are the core lessons of spirituality. That the work of being creative for humor and the work of spirituality and spiritual depth and growth are very related. And then you start to see the power and the dynamism that can come for change. So we'll get back to connecting this to that story in Exodus. So if you want to connect the Bible to Monty Python, that's what we're going to do right now. I don't think I've ever heard this sermon before, so we'll see how it goes. So if you go to the internet, you will find on YouTube, if you go and put into that search box on YouTube, John Cleese Creativity. John Cleese, one of the writers and actors from the Monty Python troupe. And he has many talks. I often wonder what he did after Monty Python and Fawlty Towers. And unfortunately, he, for many years, went and gave talks to business managers. Exactly what you would expect him to do. But he talked to managers about creativity. And so he has tons of talks about creativity. And he talks about how he did it. I always wanted to know how they came up with skit after skit after skit of things that was every time different and original and challenging and unpredictable. And he gives it all away. So you can go and watch. And as he talks about this over and over, he speaks about creativity requiring what he calls the open mode. That the open mode of our mind, when we enter our minds into this new mode, as opposed to the closed mode where we live most of our lives, when we bring ourselves into an open mode, when our minds become open in this way, it is a way of being that lets new thoughts arise without judgment or evaluation. It lets them come up, and then we find new ways of thinking, new ways of acting, new ways of speaking, that offer new breakthroughs. He uses the example of Alexander Fleming, one of the an example from science. Alexander Fleming was the one who got us rolling on the idea of penicillin. And as you might remember the story, he had set out several petri dishes for experiments, and he was growing bacteria cultures, and had left the lab and came back the next morning to see how the bacteria culture had grown. And John Cleese says, I'm so happy that Alexander Fleming was in the open mode when he came in that morning. His mind was in that open place. Because if he had been in the closed mode, he would have seen one petri dish that failed to grow the bacteria. And he would have said, this dish is not good for my experiment, let's throw it out. I have one goal in mind, and my mind is closed to everything else, so I will see that. But instead, he was in an open place, and he said, that's not what I expected. Why? And then he found out why bacteria wasn't growing. He found that there was penicillin, and set a whole world of antibiotics out from there. A scientific breakthrough that if he had not been in the right state of mind, would have looked like a total failure. So how do we get into that open mode of our mind so that we can see the world in these different ways? First of all, he says that we have to create space and then give that space to inhabit that space with time and to bring our patience and confidence into that time and that space. He calls it the oasis for our mind, a place where we can escape distractions, which is hard to do. Sometimes when I need to sit down and get some writing done or some thinking done, I like to put my phone on airplane mode just to make sure that it's not going to, a phone that's not buzzing is different than a phone that's not able to buzz. I can just know everything that's going to be there will be there when I get back. And I can create that space. I'm a person who still sits down with a yellow pad and a pen precisely because I know the yellow pad can't send me email. It can't call me. It can't remind me that I have to return that message to that person about that thing. And I can just be there in a space, in an oasis. Because as soon as we get there, we start spending our time getting ourselves to a place of openness. And that time is difficult. He actually says an hour and a half, and it's hard to spend an hour and a half. And he says, don't try to do 3 hours. You'll burn yourself out. Do a small piece, like an hour and a half, and spend some time getting yourself ready in that place, in that open oasis, into that space. Because it is, as soon as if you've ever tried to do anything like this, where you need to think something through or turn it over, idea over, or get creative, about 5 minutes in, you know what happens, right? I sit down at my desk at my house to start typing some things up that I want to preach on Sunday, and I think, oh gosh, the sink is full of dishes, and I need to empty the dishwasher and load those into the dishwasher. And while I'm up, I see that the laundry has finished, and I need to switch out the laundry. And while I'm doing that, I see my daughter's school uniform and remember, oh gosh, I got to return a call about that thing at the school because they need payment for the aftercare program. And oh God, I've got too much to do. I can't do any of this creative stuff. I'm going to do everything now. And once I've sorted the sock drawer, later I'll be creative. But if we work through that tension and that anxiety of entering into an open space, then we start to be able to ask new questions. We can come up with new ideas. We can play with things. Play is a big word that he uses in his thinking about creativity, because play is by its definition without purpose. It is able to take a question and think about it, even if it ends in being wrong or being the wrong avenue to go down, because that can still bring us around to the breakthrough later. It is something that is purposeless and free, a place where we can start to ask questions, even if they seem crazy or absurd or they go against the orthodoxy, because we need to engage that kind of freedom to say anything which might lead to a creative breakthrough, because we know we cannot be creative on the spot. If you've ever asked someone may have asked you at some point to tell a joke. And that's the exact moment when every joke you've ever heard leaves your brain, right? You cannot be creative and playful on the spot. We cannot be spontaneous within reason, right? You can't be spontaneous, but not that spontaneous. We need to have that freedom and that playfulness within our minds for that time. And then have the patience and the confidence to trust that spending that time and space in that open place of our mind will yield results. Maybe not every hour and a half. You can sit for an hour and a half and come up with nothing. I've done that plenty when I try to write. One of the things that John Cleese said was when he was writing his scripts for Monty Python, He said one of the things he noticed, that all the guys in the troupe would write their scripts and they would come together and exchange them and talk about what skits were going to make it to the show and what was going to need to be changed and who had a better idea about things. And he said there was another person on the troupe, he doesn't name the name, but he says there's another person in our troupe who I thought on the one hand was more talented than me as a comedian. He was more talented, but I produced skits and scripts that were more original. He was more talented, but I was more creative and original. And he said, I thought about this for years, about how this could be, that I could be a less talented comedian, but still be more creative and original. It seemed a contradiction. And he said, what I learned as we worked on this and talked about it over the course of years, he said, when my colleague would write a skit, if he saw a way to move the joke along or to resolve it at the end, as soon as he saw an answer, as soon as he saw a path to take, he took the first one. Every time. As soon as he saw an answer, he was inclined to take the first answer he got. John Cleese says, on the other hand, I would sit with the problem longer. And by not taking the first, sometimes more obvious answer, you gave it time and trusted the process to say, I can come up with a more creative or a more original solution than taking the first exit ramp off the highway. So there's this method of bringing ourselves to an open mode, of recognizing the oasis, of spending time there and trusting that the time that you spend in that system. Of course, the open mode, as I said before, has also a closed mode, the place where we spend most of our lives. If we want to shut down creativity, sometimes we see this in business or in politics and even in church life. We can see the kind of where the closed mode comes from. It very often comes from the need to look right in public to other people, the need to look decisive and strong, the need to assert yourself and to put others down. It stifles that kind of open thinking whereby we can have ideas and questions that are flat out wrong, but they lead us later on to the breakthrough. We can have that playfulness and purposelessness of saying things that might be wrong or look silly. The need to be able to have others have the security to put forward their ideas in the conversation. The other way that we can shut down that creativity is not just the need to look right and project a public image of ourselves that looks tough and decisive, but he said just to have a great sense of urgency, right? Of all the little jobs you've got to do in life. That's what I spend most of my time folding laundry and changing the dishes and doing that stuff in my life. It's active. There's lots going on. It's anxious a lot of times. It's purposeful, not purposeless like play. It is purposeful. It can be pleasurable. It can accomplish things. There's not always a lot of humor in it. At least I didn't think so when I last changed the dishes in the dishwasher. I didn't see much of the lighter side of it. But it creates a closed place where those new ideas and breakthroughs rarely come up. Now, this movement of recognizing when we're in the closed mode or an open mode, and the movement between them, here we go, is where I see a parallel in that reading from the book of Exodus in the Bible, in the Torah. And we see there a key about spirituality that's not just about creativity and writing. Because it's that story that began in the land of Egypt, which if you read, if you've read the Bible, if you've seen even Prince of Egypt or 10 Commandments or any of those movies that are all about Moses and the Red Sea, of course the people there in Israel are in slavery under Pharaoh. The land of Egypt, if you read the Bible very carefully, in Hebrew, the word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. The land of Egypt is the land of Mitzrayim, and that word actually means narrow. It is the land of narrowness. Now that's a literal descriptor because if you lived in Egypt in the ancient world, you lived along the Nile River, and you didn't live very far from it. So it was like a narrow strip of land. It was the land of narrowness, literally. But if we look at it another way, if we look at it spiritually, we can see the land of narrowness, the land of narrow thinking, the closed mode, a land where people had a pharaoh, a man known for rigidity and hierarchy, who had to look powerful in all circumstances and kept everybody else busy working as slaves in that authoritarian system. You can see the lifestyle and the posture of the closed mode there. And so the story begins in that land of Mitzrayim, that land of narrow thinking. And then Moses comes along. He's walking along with his sheep. He wanders away from his sheep. He takes a step away from the busyness of his job for a moment. Usually every time I see this scene of the burning bush in a movie like Prince of Egypt, the whole thing lasts about 10 seconds, and I don't believe that's how it happened. That Moses goes to the burning bush. I feel like he didn't just go there and just suddenly hear the voice of God booming out from heaven, and then he goes back to say, "Let my people go," in a Charlton Heston drama. What I think instead happened was that Moses walked over there. He saw something like Alexander Fleming, saw a bacteria dish that he couldn't explain. Moses sees something that he cannot explain, and he settles in for a while, long enough to get comfortable and take off his sandals and settle in for time. He's found the space and the time, and he hears a divine voice. He receives a vision of a different kind of world, a world that is not the land of narrowness, but it says that God would deliver them into another land, a land of promise. And that promised land is, as it says in the text, says it is a good and broad land. Not a narrow land, but a land of broadness, of openness, of wide-ranging space, of wide-ranging and broad thinking. It is a land that flows, as it says in the text, with milk and honey. But in the creative mindset, once that is turned on and the ideas start to flow, we also see that it was a land that was diverse. I will bring you into a good and broad land. What kind of land? A land with Canaanites and Perizzites and Hittites and Hivites and Jebusites. And I made you read those, Ellen. You did a good job. I almost cut that verse out, and I said, no, I think it's important to realize that in a land, when we get to that open place, when we get that vision of another world, not only is it a land of broad thinking, it is a land that is diverse as well. There are many different kinds of people living in that kind of land. And so Moses took the time to listen. He took the time to avoid taking the first possible answer, which for him was to run away to the land of Midian. He ran off and had done that, but that answer had not worked out, the most obvious answer, to run away. He had listened to God. He could say anything. He could be caught up in wonders, and as we read later in the chapter, in his own doubts about what he was being asked to do, so that he could have that power to go back to Pharaoh. Now, this kind of creativity, these moments, have spiritual analogs. When we sit down in prayer or meditation, when we know we have to stick with our meditation or our prayer, and it's tough because all that closed mode anxiety keeps going, but we stick with it. It offers, I think, a spirituality that is very active, because once we receive that vision, we got to go with it. We got to move with it. It is a kind of spirituality that helps us to change the world around us. It is the subversive Monty Python humor. It is the kind of humor and creativity that starts to unleash freedom for the people of Israel in slavery. In my work with the New Hampshire Council of Churches, there are three areas, you put it very well, Ellen, that I work on areas where all of the churches are in agreement. Which means there are three things I work on. That's about it. Everywhere else we disagree. But repealing the death penalty, a place where we are coming together, is a place that all 9 denominations are in agreement that should be done. One of our places will be with the Poor People's Campaign, and I know I recognize some Poor People's Campaign people here. One of the areas where I've seen this creative thinking happen is in our work with sanctuary churches. And I run into Allison and Tristan and others around the area, but up in Manchester, There is a church, the UU Church in Manchester, has become a level 1 sanctuary. And what sanctuary means is that a person who's being threatened with deportation can go into that church to live. So far, the current administration's immigration forces have never crossed the line and gone into a church to take someone into deportation. And we actually did have a case recently of a man in Nashua. He was in the news, so I'm not sharing anything secret. He was a person who was working on having permanent legal resident status. And while he was doing that, trying to work out that, he was also getting caught up in the process of being deported. Of course, deportation works fast, and our immigration court system works slow. So we were going to offer him sanctuary to stay in a church while that court process worked out, so he could get his fair hearing at justice in the court system. And so Manchester Unitarian, UU Church of Manchester had said, we want to be able to help with that. We want to be able to be there to bring somebody in and have them live there to get their hearing in justice. And they said the next sentence when I was talking to them about it was, but we're a small church. And we don't have the kinds of volunteers it takes. And if we give up our church hall to have a person live there, then all the things we do in our church hall can't happen there. And then all of those closed mode anxieties start popping up. Well, if we do this, what about the money? And what about the building? And what about the volunteers? And we said, as we sat and talked together, we broke out of that limited thinking that they had to do the whole thing. And I could say to them, as the Council of Churches guy, you know, in walking distance of your church is a Lutheran church, multiple Catholic churches. There's an Episcopal church, a Methodist church, another Methodist church on the other side of town, another Episcopal church on the other side of town. By the way, there are churches in Milford and Nashua who all want to do this too. So if you guys are the level 1, I guarantee you there's enough people out there who will be the volunteers and the fundraisers and all of that. And sure enough, that system, we had hoped to have 5 churches to support Manchester Unitarian Universalist Church in their work, and we have to deal with a measly 22. Because once they heard that one church took that courageous step out, everybody wanted on board. Everybody wanted to bring that broadness, that diversity, that boundless kind of thinking. And it was a creative moment that helps to change the world. It is changing the congregations that have to ask these kinds of questions, but it's also changing the world by helping people who need their voice heard in the justice system. I think it is a kind of creativity that I joked about earlier that the world is threatened by. That there is a kind of presence out there that wants us to remain in a closed mode, a place where we cannot ask deep and serious questions, the kinds of questions that we ask. I think of the Catholic bishop, he was a Latin American bishop many decades ago, who said, whenever I feed hungry people, right, a churchy thing to do, lots of churches do that, when I feed hungry people, they call me a saint. When I ask why there is a world that produces so many hungry people, that's when they attack me as a communist. Right? When I start asking the deeper questions, that's a more dangerous question, is why is the world the way it is? Why does it produce the poverty and the hunger that we see? Why does it produce the kind of immigration system that we see? And what would we change about it? Instead, we have a world that wants to project an image of always being right, of being decisive and strong and tough, that shuts other people down and tells them they're wrong, because we don't want to praise other people for having good creative ideas, because praise gives people courage. It makes people uppity when you praise them. A world that wants us to stay busy and shut all that stuff down. But instead, I think that happens because people know the open mode, that creative place. It is creative and it is dangerous when people start getting new ideas that the world has not had before. When we have new visions of a world the way it might be but isn't yet. When we start asking questions, raising doubts about the way the world is, about its established order. Because I think it is very true that the humor that we see in Monty Python, the creativity that is John Cleese can explain to us, is in fact subversive. It does touch on the very foundations of things and challenges the assumptions and brings new ideas and new visions of the world the way it might be to light. And that just might be not just a lesson in creative writing, but a lesson of spirituality, and the kind of spirituality that can change us, it can change our churches, and it might just be the creativity that is the salvation of the world.
Some things in life are bad, they can really make you sad, while other things just make you swear and curse. When you're chewing on life's gristle, don't grumble, give a whistle, girls too. And this'll help things turn out for the best.
And always look on